This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Manalive by G.K. Chesterton. Section 11, Part 1, The Enigmas of Innocent Smith. Chapter 5, The Allegorical Practical Joker. Part 3. Smith may be mad, went on the melancholy Moon in a monologue that seemed as heavy as a hatchet, but there was something after all in what he said about Home Rule for every home. Yes, there is something, when all's said and done, in the High Court of Beacon. It is really true that human beings might often get some sort of domestic justice where just now they can only get legal injustice. Oh, I'm a lawyer too, and I know that as well. It is true that there isn't too much official and indirect power. Often and often the thing a whole nation can't settle is just the thing a family could settle. Scores of young criminals have been fined and sent to jail when they ought to have been thrashed and sent to bed. Scores of men, I am sure, have had a lifetime at Hanwell when they only wanted a week at Brighton. There is something in Smith's notion of domestic self-government, and I propose that we put it into practice. You have the prisoner, you have the documents. Come, we are a company of free, white, Christian people, such as might be besieged in a town or cast up on a desert island. Let us do this thing ourselves. Let us go into that house there and sit down and find out with our own eyes and ears whether this thing is true or not, whether this Smith is a man or a monster. If we can't do a little thing like that, what right have we to put crosses on ballots? Inglewood and Pym exchanged a glance, and Warner, who was no fool, saw in that glance that Moon was gaining ground. The motives that led Arthur to think of surrender were indeed very different from those which affected Dr. Cyrus Pym. All Arthur's instincts were on the side of privacy and polite settlement. He was very English, and would often endure wrongs rather than right them by scenes and serious rhetoric. To play at once the buffoon and the knight-errant, like his Irish friend, would have been absolute torture to him. But even the semi-official part he had played that afternoon was very painful. He was not likely to be reluctant if any one could convince him that his duty was to let sleeping dogs lie. On the other hand, Cyrus Pym belonged to a country in which things are possible that seem crazy to the English. Regulations and authorities, exactly like one of Innocent's pranks or one of Michael's satires, really exist, propped by placid policemen and imposed on bustling business men. Pym knew whole states which are vast and yet secret and fanciful. Each is as big as a nation, yet as private as a lost village, and as unexpected as apple pie bed. States where no man may have a cigarette. States where any man may have 10 wives. Very strict prohibition states. Very lax divorce states. All these large local vagaries had prepared Cyrus Pym's mind for small local vagaries in a smaller country, infinitely more remote from England than any Russian or Italian. Utterly incapable of even conceiving what English conventions are, he could not see the social impossibility of the Court of Beacon. It is firmly believed by those who shared the experiment that to the very end Pym believed in that phantasmal court, and supposed it to be some Britannic institution. Towards the synod, thus somewhat at a standstill, there approached through the growing haze and gloaming a short dark figure with a walk apparently founded on the imperfect repression of a negro breakdown. Something at once in the familiarity and the incongruity of this being moved Michael to even heartier outbursts of a healthy and humane flippancy. "Why, here's little Nosey Gould!" he exclaimed. "Isn't the mere sight of him enough to banish all your morbid reflections?" "Really," replied Dr. Warner, "I really fail to see how Mr. Gould affects the question, and I once more demand—" "Hello! What's the funeral, gents?" inquired the newcomer with the air of an uproarious umpire. "Doctor demanding something? Always the way at a boarding-house, you know. Always lots of demand, no supply." As delicately and impartially as he could, Michael restated his position and indicated generally that Smith had been guilty of certain dangerous and dubious acts, and that there had even arisen an allegation that he was insane. "Well, of course he is," said Moses Gould equably. "It don't need old 'Olmes to see that. The 'awk-like face of 'Olmes," he added with abstract relish, showed a shade of disappointment, the sleuth-like Gould having got there before him. "If he is mad," began Inglewood. "Well," said Moses, "when a cove gets out on the tile the first night, there's generally a tile loose." "You never objected before," said Diana Duke rather stiffly, "and you're generally pretty free with your complaints." "I don't complain of him," said Moses magnanimously. "The poor chap's 'armless enough. You might tie him up in the garden here, and he'd make noises at the burglars." "Moses," said Moon with solemn fervour, "you are the incarnation of common sense. You think Mr. Innocent is mad. Let me introduce you to the incarnation of scientific theory. He also thinks Mr. Innocent Smith is mad. Doctor, this is my friend Mr. Gould. Moses, this is the celebrated Dr. Pym." The celebrated Dr. Cyrus Pym closed his eyes and bowed. He also murmured his national war cry in a low voice which sounded like "Pleased to meet you." "Now, you two people," said Michael cheerfully, "who both think our poor friend mad, shall jolly well go into that house over there and prove him mad. What could be more powerful than the combination of scientific theory with common sense? United you stand, divided you fall. I will not be so uncivil as to suggest that Dr. Pym has no common sense. I confine myself to recording the chronological accident that he has not shown us any so far. I take the freedom of an old friend in staking my shirt that Moses has no scientific theory. Yet against this strong coalition I am ready to appear armed with nothing but an intuition, which is American for a guess." "Distinguished by Mr. Gould's assistance," said Pym, opening his eyes suddenly, "I gather that though he and I are identical in primary diagnosis, there is yet between us something that cannot be called a disagreement, something which we may perhaps call a—" He put the points of a thumb and forefinger together, spreading the other fingers exquisitely in the air, and seemed to be waiting for somebody else to tell him what to say. "Catchin' flies?" inquired the affable Moses. "A divergence," said Dr. Pym, with a refined sigh of relief. "A divergence. Granted that the man in question is deranged, he would not necessarily be all that science requires in a homicidal maniac." "Has it occurred to you," observed Moon, who was leaning on the gate again and did not turn round, "that if he were a homicidal maniac he might have killed us all here while we were talking?" Something exploded silently underneath all their minds, like sealed dynamite in some forgotten cellars. They all remembered for the first time for some hour or two that the monster of whom they were talking was standing quietly among them. They had left him in the garden like a garden statue. There might have been a dolphin coiling round his legs, or a fountain pouring out of his mouth, for all the notice they had taken of Innocent Smith. He stood with his crest of blonde blown hair thrust somewhat forward, his fresh-coloured, rather short-sighted face looking patiently downwards at nothing in particular, his huge shoulders humped and his hands in his trousers pockets. So far as they could guess, he had not moved at all. His green coat might have been cut out of the green turf on which he stood. In his shadow Pym had expounded and Rosamund expostulated, Michael had ranted and Moses had ragged. He had remained like a thing graven, the god of the garden. A sparrow had perched on one of his heavy shoulders, and then, after correcting its costume of feathers, had flown away. "Why," cried Michael with a shout of laughter, "the court of Beacon has opened. And shut up again, too. You all know now I am right. Your buried common sense has told you what my buried common sense has told me. Smith might have fired off 100 cannons instead of a pistol, and you would still know he was harmless as I know he is harmless. Back we all go to the house and clear a room for discussion, for the High Court of Beacon, which has already arrived at its decision, is just about to begin its inquiry. "Just going to begin," cried little Mr. Moses, in an extraordinary sort of disinterested excitement, like that of an animal during a music or a thunderstorm. "Follow on to the 'Igh Court of Eggs and Bacon. 'Ave a kipper from the old firm." Its lordship complimented Mr. Gould on the 'igh professional delicacy he had shown, and which was worthy of the best traditions of the saloon bar, and 3 of Scotch hot, miss. Oh, chase me, girls. The girls betrayed no temptation to chase him. He went away in a sort of waddling dance of pure excitement, and had made a circuit of the garden before he reappeared, breathless, but still beaming. Moon had known his man when he realized that no people presented to Moses Gould could be quite serious, even if they were quite furious. The glass door stood open on the side nearest to Mr. Moses Gould, and as the feet of that festive idiot were evidently turned in the same direction, everybody else went that way with the unanimity of some uproarious procession. Only Diana Duke retained enough rigidity to say the thing that had been boiling at her fierce feminine lips for the last few hours. Under the shadow of tragedy she had kept it back as unsympathetic. "In that case," she said sharply, "these cabs can be sent away." "Well, Innocent must have his bag, you know," said Mary with a smile. "I dare say the cabman would get it down for us." "I'll get the bag," said Smith, speaking for the first time in hours. His voice sounded remote and rude, like the voice of a statue. Those who had so long danced and disputed round his immobility were left breathless by his precipitance. With a run in spring he was out of the garden into the street. With a spring and one quivering kick he was actually on the roof of the cab. The cabman happened to be standing by the horse's head, having just removed its emptied nose-bag. Smith seemed for an instant to be rolling about on the cab's back in the embraces of his Gladstone bag. The next instant, however, he had rolled, as if by a royal luck, into the high seat behind, and with a shriek of piercing and appalling suddenness had sent the horse flying and scampering down the street. His evanescence was so violent and swift that this time it was all the other people who were turned into garden statues. Mr. Moses Gould, however, being ill adapted both physically and morally for the purposes of permanent sculpture, came to life some time before the rest, and turning to Moon remarked, like a man standing chattily with a stranger on an omnibus, "Tile loose, huh? Cab loose, anyhow." There followed a fatal silence, and then Dr. Warner said with a sneer like a club of stone, "This is what comes of the Court of Beacon, Mr. Moon. You have let loose a maniac on the whole metropolis." Beacon House stood, as it has been said, at the end of a long crescent of continuous houses. The little garden that shut it in ran out into a sharp point like a green cape pushed into the sea of two streets. Smith and his cab shot up one side of the triangle, and certainly most of those standing inside of it never expected to see him again. At the apex, however, he turned the horse sharply round and drove with equal violence up the other side of the garden. Visible to all those in the group, with a common impulse, the little crowd ran across the lawn as if to stop him. But they soon had reason to duck and recoil. Even as he vanished up the street for the second time, he let the big yellow bag fly from his hand, so that it fell in the centre of the garden, scattering the company like a bomb, and nearly damaging Dr. Warner's hat for the third time. Long before they had collected themselves, the cab had shot away with a shriek that went into a whisper. "Well," said Michael Moon, with a queer note in his voice, "you may as well all go inside anyhow. We've got two relics of Mr. Smith at least, his fiancée and his trunk." "Why do you want us to go inside?" asked Arthur Inglewood, in whose red brow and rough brown hair botheration seemed to have reached its limit. End of section 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Manalive by G.K. Chesterton. Section 12, Part 1, The Enigmas of Innocent Smith. Chapter 5, The Allegorical Practical Joker. Part 4. "I want the rest to go in," said Michael, in a clear voice, "because I want the whole of this garden in which to talk to you." There was an atmosphere of irrational doubt. It was really getting colder, and a night wind had begun to wave one or two trees in the twilight. Dr. Warner, however, spoke in a voice devoid of indecision. "I refuse to listen to any such proposal," he said. "You have lost this ruffian, and I must find him." "I don't ask you to listen to any proposal," answered Moon quietly. "I only ask you to listen." He made a silencing movement with his hand, and immediately the whistling noise that had been lost in the dark streets on one side of the house could be heard from quite a new quarter on the other side. Through the night maze of streets the noise increased with incredible rapidity, and the next moment the flying hoofs and flashing wheels had swept up to the blue railed gate at which they had originally stood. Mr. Smith got down from his perch with an air of absent-mindedness, and coming back into the garden, stood in the same elephantine attitude as before. "Get inside, get inside," cried Moon hilariously, with the air of one shooing a company of cats. "Come, come, be quick about it. Didn't I tell you I wanted to talk to Inglewood?" How they were all really driven into that house again, it would have been difficult afterwards to say. They had reached the point of being exhausted with incongruities, as people in a farce are ill with laughing, and the brisk growth of the storm among the trees seemed like a final gesture of things in general. Inglewood lingered behind them, saying with certain amicable exasperation, "I say, do you really want to speak to me?" "I do," said Michael, "very much." Night had come, as it generally does, quicker than the twilight had seemed to promise. While the human eye still felt the sky as light grey, a very large and lustrous moon, appearing abruptly above a bulk of roofs and trees, proved by contrast that the sky was already a very dark grey indeed. A drift of barren leaves across the lawn, a drift of riven clouds across the sky, seemed to be lifted on the same strong and yet laborious wind. "Arthur," said Michael, "I began with an intuition, but now I am sure. You and I are going to defend this friend of yours before the blessed court of Beacon, and to clear him too, clear him of both crime and lunacy. Just listen to me while I preach to you for a bit." They walked up and down the darkening garden together, as Michael Moon went on. "Can you," asked Michael Moon, "shut your eyes and see some of those queer old hieroglyphics they stuck up on white walls in the old hot countries? How stiff they were in shape, and yet how gaudy in colour. Think of some alphabet of arbitrary figures, picked out in black and red and white and green, with some old Semitic crowd of nosy Gould's ancestors staring at it, and try to think why the people put it up at all." Inglewood's first instinct was to think that his perplexing friend had really gone off his head at last. There seemed so reckless a flight of irrelevancy from the tropic-pictured walls he was asking to imagine to the grey, windswept, and somewhat chilly suburban garden in which he was actually kicking his heels. How he could be more happy in one by imagining the other he could not conceive. Both in themselves were unpleasant. "Why does everybody repeat riddles?" went on Moon abruptly, "even if they've forgotten the answers? Riddles are easy to remember because they are hard to guess. So were those stiff old symbols in black, red, or green easy to remember because they had been hard to guess. Their colours were plain, their shapes were plain, everything was plain except the meaning." Inglewood was about to open his mouth in an amiable protest, but Moon went on, plunging quicker and quicker up and down the garden, and smoking faster and faster. "Dances, too," he said. "Dances were not frivolous. Dances were harder to understand than inscriptions and texts. The old dances were stiff, ceremonial, highly coloured, but silent. Have you noticed anything odd about Smith?" Well, really, cried Inglewood, left behind in a collapse of humour. Have I noticed anything else? Have you noticed this about him? Asked Moon, with unshaken persistency. That he has done so much and said so little. When first he came he talked, but in a gasping, irregular sort of way, as if he wasn't used to it. All he really did was actions, painting red flowers on black gowns or throwing yellow bags onto the grass. I tell you that big green figure is figurative, like any green figure capering on some white eastern wall. "My dear Michael," cried Inglewood, in rising irritation, which increased with the rising wind, "you are getting absurdly fanciful." "I think of what has just happened," said Michael steadily. "The man has not spoken for hours, and yet he has been speaking all the time. He fired 3 shots from a 6-shooter, and then gave it up to us, when he might have shot us dead in our boots. How could he express his trust in us better than that? He wanted to be tried by us. How could he have shown it better than by standing quite still and letting us discuss it? He wanted to show that he stood there willingly and could escape if he liked. How could he have shown it better than by escaping in the cab and coming back again? Innocent Smith is not a madman. He is a ritualist. He wants to express himself not with his tongue but with his arms and legs. 'With my body I thee worship,' as it says in the marriage service. I begin to understand the old plays and pageants. I see why the mutes at a funeral were mute. I see why the mummers were mum. They meant something, and Smith means something too. All other jokes have to be noisy, like Little Nosey Gould's jokes, for instance. The only silent jokes are the practical jokes. Poor Smith, properly considered, is an allegorical practical joker. What he has really done in this house has been as frantic as a war dance, but as silent as a picture." "I suppose you mean," said the other dubiously, "that we have got to find out what all these crimes meant, as if they were so many coloured picture puzzles. But even supposing that they do mean something, why, Lord bless my soul!" Taking the turn of the garden quite naturally, he had lifted his eyes to the moon, by this time risen big and luminous, and had seen a huge half-human figure sitting on the garden wall. It was outlined so sharply against the moon that for the first flash it was hard to be certain even that it was human. The hunched shoulders and outstanding hair had rather the air of a colossal cat. It resembled a cat also in the fact that when first startled it sprang up and ran with easy activity along the top of the wall. As it ran, however, its heavy shoulders and small stooping head rather suggested a baboon. The instant it came within reach of a tree it made an ape-like leap and was lost in the branches. The gale, which by this time was shaking every shrub in the garden, made the identification yet more difficult, since it melted the moving limbs of the fugitive in the multitudinous moving limbs of the tree. "Who is there?" shouted Arthur. "Who are you? Are you innocent?" "Not quite," answered an obscure voice among the leaves. "I cheated you once about a penknife." The wind in the garden had gathered strength, and was throwing the tree backwards and forwards with the man in the thick of it, just as it had on the gay and golden afternoon when he had first arrived. "But are you Smith?" asked Inglewood, as in an agony. "Very nearly," said the voice out of the tossing tree. "But you must have some real name," shrieked Inglewood in dismay. "You must call yourself something." "Call myself something," thundered the obscure voice, shaking the tree so that all its 10,000 leaves seemed to be talking at once. "I call myself Roland, Oliver, Isaiah, Charlemagne, Arthur, Hildebrand, Homer, Danton, Michelangelo, Shakespeare, Breakspeare." "But, man alive!" cried Inglewood in exasperation. "That's right, that's right," came with a roar out of the rocking tree. "That's my real name." And he broke a branch, and 1 or 2 autumn leaves fluttered away across the moon. End of chapter 5. End of part 1. End of section 12. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Manalive by G. K. Chesterton. Section 13, Part 2, The Explanations of Innocent Smith. Chapter 1, The Eye of Death, or the Murder Charge. Part 1. The dining-room of the Dukes had been set out for the Court of Beacon with a certain impromptu pomposity that seemed somehow to increase its coziness. The big room was, as it were, cut up into the small rooms, with walls only waist-high, the sort of separation that children make when they are playing at shops. This had been done by Moses Gould and Michael Moon, the two most active members of this remarkable inquiry, with the ordinary furniture of the place. At one end of the long mahogany table was set the one enormous garden chair, which was surmounted by the old torn tent or umbrella which Smith himself had suggested as a coronation canopy. Inside this erection could be perceived the dumpy form of Mrs. Duke, with cushions and a form of countenance that already threatened slumber. At the other end sat the accused Smith in a kind of dock, for he was carefully fenced in with a quadrilateral of light bedroom chairs, any of which he could have tossed out the window with his big toe. He had been provided with pens and paper, out of the latter of which he made paper boats, paper darts, and paper dolls contentedly throughout the whole proceedings. He never spoke or even looked up, but seemed as unconscious as a child on the floor of an empty nursery. On a row of chairs raised high on the top of a long settee sat the three young ladies with their backs up against the window, and Mary Gray in the middle of it was something between a jury box and the stall of the Queen of Beauty at a tournament. Down the centre of the long table Moon had built a low barrier out of 8 bound volumes of good words to express the moral wall that divided the conflicting parties. On the right side sat the two advocates of the prosecution, Dr. Pym and Mr. Gould, behind a barricade of books and documents, chiefly, in the case of Dr. Pym, solid volumes of criminology. On the other side, Moon and Inglewood, for the defence, were also fortified with books and papers, but as these included several old yellow volumes by Ouida and Wilkie Collins, the hand of Mr. Moon seemed to have been somewhat careless and comprehensive. As for the victim and prosecutor, Dr. Warner, Moon wanted at first to have him kept entirely behind a high screen in the corner, urging the indelicacy of his appearance in court, but privately assuring him of an unofficial permission to peep over the top now and then. Dr. Warner, however, failed to rise to the chivalry of such a course, and after some little disturbance and discussion he was accommodated with a seat on the right side of the table in a line with his legal advisers. It was before this solidly established tribunal that Dr. Cyrus Pym, after passing a hand through the honey-coloured hair over each ear, rose to open the case. His statement was clear and even restrained, and such flights of imagery as occurred in it only attracted attention by a certain indescribable abruptness, not uncommon in the flowers of American speech. He planted the points of his 10 frail fingers on the mahogany, closed his eyes, and opened his mouth. "The time has gone by," he said, "when murder could be regarded as a moral and individual act, important perhaps to the murderer, perhaps to the murdered. Science has profoundly—" Here he paused, poising his compressed finger and thumb in the air, as if he were holding an elusive idea very tight by its tail. Then he screwed up his eyes and said, "modified," and let it go. "Has profoundly modified our view of death. In superstitious ages it was regarded as the termination of life, catastrophic and even tragic, and was often surrounded by solemnity. Brighter days, however, have dawned, and we now see death as universal and inevitable, as part of that great soul-stirring and heart-upholding average which we call, for convenience, the order of nature. In the same way we have come to consider murder socially. Rising above the mere private feelings of a man, while being forcibly deprived of life, we are privileged to behold a murder as a mighty whole, to see the rich rotation of the cosmos bringing, as it brings, the golden harvests and the golden-bearded harvesters, the return for ever of the slayers and the slain. He looked down, somewhat affected with his own eloquence, coughed slightly, putting up 4 of his pointed fingers with the excellent manners of Boston, and continued. There is but one result of this happier and humaner outlook which concerns the wretched man before us. It is that thoroughly elucidated by a Milwaukee doctor, our great secret-guessing Sonnenschein, in his great work, The Destructive Type. We do not denounce Smith as a murderer, but rather as a murderous man. The type is such that its very life, I might say its very health, is in killing. Some hold that it is not properly an aberration, but a newer and even higher creature. My dear old friend Dr. Bulger, who kept ferrets—" Here Moon suddenly ejaculated aloud, "Hurrah!" but so instantaneously resumed his tragic expression that Mrs. Duke looked everywhere else for the sound. Dr. Pym continued somewhat sternly, "who, in the interests of knowledge, kept ferrets, felt that the creature's ferocity is not utilitarian, but absolutely an end in itself. However this may be with ferrets, it is certainly so with the prisoner. In his other iniquities you may find the cunning of the maniac, but his acts of blood have almost the simplicity of sanity. But it is the awful sanity of the sun and the elements, a cruel and evil sanity. As soon stay the iris-leapt cataracts of our virgin West as stay the natural force that sends him forth to slay. No environment, however scientific, could have softened him. Place that man in the silver silent purity of the palest cloister, and there will be some deed of violence done with the crozier or the alb. Rear him in a happy nursery amid our brave-browed Anglo-Saxon infancy, and he will find some way to strangle with the skipping rope or brain with the brick. Circumstances may be favourable, training may be admirable, hopes may be high, but the huge elemental hunger of innocent Smith for blood will, in its appointed season, burst like a well-timed bomb." Arthur Inglewood glanced curiously for an instant at the huge creature at the foot of the table, who was fitting a paper figure with a cocked hat, and then looked back at Dr. Pym, who was concluding in a quieter tone. "It only remains for us," he said, "to bring forward actual evidence of his previous attempts. By an agreement already made with the court and the leaders of the defence, we are permitted to put in evidence authentic letters from witnesses to these scenes, which the defence is free to examine. Out of several of such outrages we have decided to select one, the clearest and most scandalous. I will therefore, without further delay, call on my junior, Mr. Gould, to read 2 letters, one from Sub-Warden and the other from the porter of Breakspeare College in Cambridge University." Gould jumped up with a jerk, like a jack-in-the-box, an academic-looking paper in his hand and a fever of importance on his face. He began in a loud, high Cockney voice that was as abrupt as a cock-crow. "Sir, I am Sub-Warden of Breakspeare College, Cambridge." "Lord have mercy on us," muttered Moon, making a backward movement as men do when a gun goes off. "I am the Sub-Warden of Breakspeare College, Cambridge," proclaimed the uncompromising Moses, "and I can endorse the description you gave of the unhappy Smith. It was not alone my unfortunate duty to rebuke many of the lesser violences of his undergraduate period, but I was actually a witness to the last iniquity which terminated that period. I happened to passing under the house of my friend, the Warden of Breakspeare, which is semi-detached from the college, and connected with it by 2 or 3 very ancient arches or props, like bridges, across a small strip of water connected with the river. To my grief astonishment, I beheld my eminent friend suspended in mid-air and clinging to one of these pieces of masonry, his appearance and attitude indicating that he suffered from the gravest apprehensions. After a short time I heard 2 very loud shots, and distinctly perceived the unfortunate undergraduate Smith leaning far out of the warden's window and aiming at the warden repeatedly with a revolver. Upon seeing me, Smith burst into a loud laugh, in which impertinence was mingled with insanity, and appeared to desist. I sent the college porter for a ladder, and he succeeded in detaching the warden from his painful position. Smith was sent down. The photograph I enclose is from the group of the University Rifle Club prizemen, and represents him as he was when at the college. I am your obedient servant, Amos Boodler. The other letter, continued Gould in a glow of triumph, is from the porter, and it won't take long to read. Dear Sir, it is quite true that I am porter of Brixpeer College, and that I helped the warden down when the young man was shooting at him, as Mr. Bolter has said in his letter. The young man who was shooting at him was Mr. Smith, the same that is in the photograph Mr. Bolter sends. Yours respectfully, Samuel Barker. Gould handed the two letters across to Moon, who examined them, but for the vocal divergences in the matter of H's and A's, the sub-warden's letter was exactly as Gould had rendered it, and both that and the porter's letter were plainly genuine. Moon handed them to Inglewood, who handed them back in silence to Moses Gould. So far as this first charge of continual attempted murder is concerned, said Dr. Pym, standing up for the last time, that is my case. Michael Moon rose for the defence with an air of depression which gave little hope at the outset to the sympathizers with the prisoner. He did not, he said, propose to follow the doctor into the abstract questions. I do not know enough to be an agnostic, he said rather wearily, and I can only master the known and admitted elements in such controversies. As for science and religion, the known and admitted facts are plain enough. All that the parsons say is unproved, all that the doctors say is disproved. That's the only difference between science and religion there's ever been or will be. Yet these new discoveries touch me somehow, he said, looking down sorrowfully at his boots. They remind me of a dear old great-aunt of mine who used to enjoy them in her youth. It brings tears to my eyes. I can see the old bucket by his garden fence, and the line of shimmering poplars behind. "Hi, here! Stop the bus a bit," cried Mr. Moses Gould, riding in a sort of perspiration. "We want to give the defence a fair run, like gents, you know, but any gent would draw the line at shimmering poplars." "Well, hang it all," said Moon, in an injured manner, "if Dr. Pym may have an old friend with ferrets, why mayn't I have an old aunt with poplars?" "Why, as to liking her," began Moon, "but perhaps, as you say, she is scarcely the core of the question. I repeat that I do not mean to follow the abstract speculations. For indeed my answer to Dr. Pym is simple and severely concrete. Dr. Pym has only treated one side of the psychology of murder. If it is true that there is a kind of man who has a natural tendency to murder, is it not equally true," here he lowered his voice and spoke with a crushing quietude and earnestness, "is it not equally true that there is a kind of man who has a natural tendency to get murdered? Is it not at least a hypothesis holding the field that Dr. Warner is such a man? I do not speak without the book any more than my learned friend. The whole matter is expounded in Moonshine's monumental work, The Destructible Doctor, with diagrams showing the various ways in which such a person as Dr. Warner may be resolved into his elements. In the light of these facts—" "Hi! Stop the bus! Stop the bus!" cried Moses, jumping up and down, gesticulating in great excitement. "My principal's got something to say. My principal wants to do a bit of talking." Dr. Pym was indeed on his feet, looking pallid and rather vicious. "I have strictly confined myself," he said nasally, "to books to which immediate reference can be made. I have Sonnershine's destructive type here on the table, if the defence wish to see it. Where is this wonderful work on the destructibility Mr. Moon is talking about? Does it exist? Can he produce it?" End of section 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Manalive by G.K. Chesterton. Section 14, Part 2, The Allegorical Practical Joker, Chapter 1, The Eye of Death, or the Murder Charge, Part 2. "Produce it!" cried the Irishman, with a rich scorn. "I'll produce it in a week, if you'll pay for the ink and paper." "Would it have much authority?" asked Pym, sitting down. "Oh, authority," said Moon lightly. "That depends on a fellow's religion." Dr. Pym jumped up again. "Our authority is based on masses of accurate detail," he said. "It deals with a region in which things can be handled and tested. My opponent will at least admit that death is a fact of experience." "Not of mine," said Moon mournfully, shaking his head. "I've never experienced such a thing in all my life." "Well, really," said Dr. Pym, and sat down sharply amid a crackle of papers. "So we see," resumed Moon in the same melancholy voice, "that a man like Dr. Warner is, in the mysterious workings of evolution, doomed to such attacks. My client's onslaught, even if it occurred, was not unique. I have in my hand letters from more than one acquaintance of Dr. Warner whom that remarkable man has affected in the same way. Following the example of my learned friends, I will read only two of them. The first is from an honest and laborious matron living off the Harrow Road. "Mr. Moon, sir, yes, I did throw a saucepan at him. What then? It was all I had to throw, all the soft things being porn. And if your Dr. Warner doesn't like having saucepans thrown at him, don't let him wear his hat in a respectable woman's parlour, and tell him to leave off smiling or tell us jokes. Yours respectfully, Hannah Miles." The other letter is from a physician of some note in Dublin, with whom Dr. Warner was once engaged in a consultation. He writes as follows: "Dear Sir, the incident to which you refer is one which I regret, and which, moreover, I have never been able to explain. My own branch of medicine is not mental, and I should be glad to have the view of a mental specialist on my singular, momentary, and indeed almost automatic action. To say that I pulled Dr. Warner's nose is, however, inaccurate in a respect that strikes me as important. That I punched his nose I must cheerfully admit, I need not say with what regret. But pulling seems to me to imply a precision of objective which I cannot reproach myself. In comparison with this, the act of punching was an outward, instantaneous, and even natural gesture. Believe me, yours faithfully, Burton Lestrange." "I have numberless other letters," continued Moon, "all bearing witness to this widespread feeling about my eminent friend. And I therefore think that Dr. Pym should have admitted this side of the question in his survey. We are in the presence, as Dr. Pym so truly says, of a natural force. As soon stay the cataract of the London waterworks as stay the great tendency of Dr. Warner to be assassinated by somebody. Place that man in a Quakers' meeting among the most peaceful Christians, and he will immediately be beaten to death with sticks of chocolate. Place him among the angels of the New Jerusalem, and he will be stoned to death with precious stones. Circumstances may be beautiful and wonderful, the average may be hard upholding, the harvester may be golden-bearded, and the doctor may be secret guessing. The cataract may be iris-lept, the Anglo-Saxon infant may be brave-browed. But against and above all these prodigies, the grand, simple tendency of Dr. Warner to get murdered will still pursue its way until it happily and triumphantly succeeds at last." He pronounced this peroration with an appearance of strong emotion, but even stronger emotions were manifesting themselves on the other side of the table. Dr. Warner had leaned his large body quite across the little figure of Moses Gould, and was talking in excited whispers to Dr. Pym. That expert nodded a great many times, and finally started to his feet with a sincere expression of sternness. "Ladies and gentlemen," he cried indignantly, "as my colleague has said, we should be delighted to give any latitude to the defence, if there were a defence. But Mr. Moon seems to think he is there to make jokes. Very good jokes, I dare say, but not at all adapted to assist his client. He picks holes in science. He picks holes in my client's social popularity. He picks holes in my literary style, which doesn't seem to suit his high-toned European taste. But how does this picking of holes affect the issue? This Smith has picked 2 holes in my client's hat, and with an inch better aim would have picked 2 holes in his head. All the jokes in the world won't unpick those holes or be any use for the defence." Inglewood looked down in some embarrassment, as if shaken by the evident fairness of this. But Moon still gazed at his opponent in a dreamy way. "The defence?" he said vaguely. "Oh, I haven't begun that yet." "You certainly have not," said Pym warmly, amid a murmur of applause from his side, which the other side found it impossible to answer. "Perhaps if you have any defence, which has been doubtful from the beginning—" "While you are standing up," said Moon, in the same almost sleepy style, "perhaps I might ask you a question." "A question? Certainly," said Pym stiffly. "It was distinctly arranged between us that we could not cross-examine the witnesses. We might vicariously cross-examine each other. We are in a position to invite all such inquiry." "I think you said," observed Moon absently, "that none of the prisoner's shots really hit the doctor." "For the cause of science," cried the complacent Pym, "fortunately not." "Yet they were fired from a few feet away." "Yes, about 4 feet." "And no shots hit the warden, though they were fired quite close to him too?" asked Moon. "That is so," said the witness gravely. "I think," said Moon, suppressing a slight yawn, "that your sub-warden mentioned that Smith was one of the University's record men for shooting." "Why, as to that—" began Pym, after an instant's stillness. "A second question," continued Moon, comparatively curtly. "You said there were other cases of the accused trying to kill people. Why have you not got evidence of them?" The American planted the points of his fingers on the table again. "In those cases," he said precisely, "there was no evidence from outsiders, as in the Cambridge case, but only the evidence of the actual victims." "Why didn't you get their evidence?" "In the case of the actual victims," said Pym, "there was some difficulty and reluctance and—" "Do you mean," asked Moon, "that none of the actual victims would appear against the prisoner?" "That would be exaggerative," began the other. "A third question," said Moon, so sharply that everyone jumped. "You've got the evidence of the sub-warden, who heard some shots. Where's the evidence of the warden himself, who was shot at? The warden of Brakespeare lives a prosperous gentleman." "We did ask for a statement from him," said Pym a little nervously, "but it was so eccentrically expressed that we pressed it out of deference to an old gentleman whose past services to science have been great." Moon leaned forward. "You mean, I suppose, that his statement was favourable to the prisoner?" "It might be understood so," replied the American doctor, "but really it was difficult to understand at all. In fact, we sent it back to him." "You have no longer, then, any statement signed by the warden of Brakespeare?" "No." "I only ask," said Michael quietly, "because we have. To conclude my case, I will ask my junior, Mr. Inglewood, to read a statement of the true story, a statement attested as true by the signature of the warden himself." Arthur Inglewood rose with several papers in his hand, and though he looked somewhat refined and self-effacing, as he always did, the spectators were surprised to feel that his presence was, upon the whole, more efficient and sufficing than his leader's. He was, in truth, one of those modest men who cannot speak until they are told to speak, and then can speak well. Moon was entirely the opposite. His own impudences amused him in private, but they slightly embarrassed him in public. He felt a fool while he was speaking, whereas Inglewood felt a fool only because he could not speak. The moment he had anything to say he could speak, and the moment he could speak, speaking seemed quite natural. Nothing in this universe seemed quite natural to Michael Moon. "As my colleague has just explained," said Inglewood, "there are two enigmas or inconsistencies on which we base the defence. The first is a plain physical fact. By the admission of everybody, by the very evidence adduced by the prosecution, it is clear that the accused was celebrated as a specially good shot. Yet on both the occasions complained of he shot from a distance of 4 or 5 feet, and shot at him 4 or 5 times, and never hit him once. That is the first startling circumstance on which we base our argument. The second, as my colleague has urged, is the curious fact that we cannot find a single victim of these alleged outrages to speak for himself. Subordinates speak for him, porters climb up ladders to him, but he himself is silent. Ladies and gentlemen, I propose to explain on the spot both the riddle of the shots and the riddle of the silence. I will first of all read the covering letter in which the true account of the Cambridge incident is contained, and then that document itself. When you have heard both, there will be no doubt about your decision. The covering letter runs as follows. Dear Sir, the following is a very exact and even vivid account of the incident as it really happened at Breakspeare College. We, the undersigned, do not see any particular reason why we should refer it to any isolated authorship. The truth is, it has been a composite production, and we have even had some difference of opinion about the adjectives, but every word of it is true. We are, yours faithfully, Wilfred Emerson Eames, Warden of Breakspeare College, Cambridge. Innocent Smith. The enclosed statement, continued Inglewood, runs as follows. A celebrated English university backs so abruptly on the river that it has, so to speak, to be propped up and patched with all sorts of bridges and semi-detached buildings. The river splits itself into several small streams and canals, so that in one or two corners the place has almost the look of Venice. It was so especially in the case with which we are concerned, in which a few flying buttresses or airy ribs of stone sprang across a strip of water to connect Breakspeare College with the house of the Warden of Breakspeare. The country around these colleges is flat, but it does not seem flat when one is thus in the midst of the colleges, for in these flat fens there are always wandering lakes and lingering rivers of water, and these always change what might have been a scheme of horizontal lines into a scheme of vertical lines. Wherever there is water, the height of high buildings is doubled, and a British brick house becomes a Babylonian tower. In that shining, unshaken surface, the houses hang head downwards, exactly to their highest or lowest chimney. The coral-coloured cloud seen in that abyss is as far below the world as its origin appears above it. Every scrap of water is not only a window, but a skylight. Earth splits under men's feet into precipitous aerial perspectives, into which a bird could as easily wing its way as... End of section 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Manalive by G.K. Chesterton. Section 15. Part 2. The Explanations of Innocent Smith. Chapter 1. The Eye of Death, or the Murder Charge. Part 3. Dr. Cyrus Pym rose in protest. The documents he had put in evidence had been confined to cold affirmation of fact. The defence, in a general way, had an indubitable right to put their case in their own way, but all this landscape gardening seemed to him, Dr. Cyrus Pym, to be not up to the business. "Will the leader of the defence tell me," he asked, "how it can possibly affect this case that a cloud was coral-coloured, or that a bird could have winged itself anywhere?" "Oh, I don't know," said Michael, lifting himself lazily. "You see, you don't know yet what our defence is. Till you know that, don't you see, anything may be relevant. Why, suppose," he said suddenly, as if an idea had struck him, "suppose we wanted to prove the old Warden colour-blind. Suppose he was shot by a black man with white hair, when he thought he was being shot by a white man with yellow hair. To ascertain if that cloud was really and truly coral-coloured might be of the most massive importance." He paused with a seriousness which was hardly generally shared, and continued with the same fluency. "Or suppose we wanted to maintain that the Warden committed suicide, that he just got Smith to hold the pistol as Brutus' slave held the sword. Why, it would make all the difference whether the Warden could see himself plain in still water. Still water has made hundreds of suicides. One sees oneself so very, well, so very plain." "Do you perhaps," inquired Pym with austere irony, "maintain that your client was a bird of some sort, say a flamingo?" "In the matter of his being a flamingo," said Moon with sudden severity, "my client reserves his defence." No one quite knowing what to make of this, Mr. Moon resumed his seat, and Inglewood resumed the reading of his document. "There is something pleasing to a mystic in such a land of mirrors. For a mystic is one who holds that two worlds are better than one. In the highest sense, indeed, all thought is reflection. This is the real truth in the saying that second thoughts are best. Animals have no second thoughts. Man alone is able to see his own thought double. As a drunkard sees a lamp-post, man alone is able to see his own thought upside down, as one sees a house in a puddle. This duplication of mentality as in a mirror is, we repeat, the inmost thing of human philosophy. There is a mystical, even a monstrous truth in the statement that two heads are better than one, but they ought both to grow on the same body. "I know it's a little transcendental at first," interposed Inglewood, beaming round with broad apology, "but you see this document was written in collaboration by a Don and a—" "Drunkard, suggested Moses Gould, beginning to enjoy himself. "I rather think," proceeded Inglewood with an unruffled and critical air, "that this part was written by the Don. I merely warn the court that the statement, though indubitably accurate, bears here and there the trace of coming from two authors." "In that case," said Dr. Pym, leaning back and sniffing, "I cannot agree with them that two heads are better than one. The undersigned persons think it needless to touch on a kindred problem so often discussed at committees for university reform, the question of whether dons see double because they are drunk, or get drunk because they see double. It is enough for them, the undersigned persons, if they are able to pursue their own peculiar and profitable theme, which is puddles. What, the undersigned persons ask themselves, is a puddle? A puddle repeats infinity and is full of light. Nevertheless, if analysed objectively, a puddle is a piece of dirty water spread very thin on mud. The two great historic universities of England have all this large and level and reflective brilliance. Nevertheless, or rather, on the other hand, they are puddles. Puddles, 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 puddles. The undersigned persons ask you to excuse an emphasis inseparable from strong conviction." Inglewood ignored a somewhat wild expression on the faces of some present, and continued with eminent cheerfulness. "Such were the thoughts that failed to cross the mind of the undergraduate Smith as he picked his way among the stripes of canals and the glittering rainy gutters into which the waters broke up round the back of Brakespeare College. Had these thoughts crossed his mind, he would have been much happier than he was. Unfortunately, he did not know that his puzzles were puddles. He did not know that the academic mind reflects infinity and is full of light by the simple process of being shallow and standing still. In his case, therefore, there was something solemn and even evil about the infinity implied. It was half-way through a starry night of bewildering brilliancy. Stars were both above and below. To young Smith's sullen fancy, the skies below seemed even hollower than the skies above. He had a horrible idea that if he counted the stars he would find one too many in the pool. In crossing the little paths and bridges, he felt like one stepping on the black and slender ribs of some cosmic Eiffel Tower. For to him and nearly all the educated youth of that epoch the stars were cruel things. Though they glowed in the great dome every night, they were an enormous and ugly secret. They uncovered the nakedness of nature. They were a glimpse of the iron wheels and pulleys behind the scenes. For the young men of that sad time thought that the God always comes from the machine. They did not know that in reality the machine only comes from the God. In short, they were all pessimists, and starlight was atrocious to them, atrocious because it was true. All their universe was black with white spots. Smith looked up with relief from the glittering pools below to the glittering skies and the great black bulk of the college. The only light other than stars glowed through one peacock green curtain in the upper part of the building, marking where Dr. Emerson Eames always worked till morning, and received his friends and favourite pupils at any hour of the night. Indeed, it was to his rooms that the melancholy Smith was bound. Smith had been at Dr. Eames's lecture for the first half of the morning, and at pistol practice and fencing in a saloon for the second half. He had been sculling madly for the first half of the afternoon, and thinking idly and still more madly for the second half. He had gone to a supper where he was uproarious, and on to a debating club where he was perfectly insufferable. And the melancholy Smith was melancholy still. Then, as he was going home to his diggings, he remembered the eccentricity of his friend and master, the warden of Breakspeare, and resolved desperately to turn into that gentleman's private house. Emerson Eames was an eccentric in many ways, but his throne in philosophy and metaphysics was of international eminence. The university could hardly have afforded to lose him, and moreover a Don has only to continue any of his bad habits long enough to make them a part of the British Constitution. The bad habits of Emerson Eames were to sit up all night and to be a student of Schopenhauer. Personally, he was a lean, lounging sort of man with a blond, pointed beard, not so very much older than his pupil Smith in the matter of mere years, but older by centuries in two essential respects, of having a European reputation and a bald head. "I came against the rules at this unearthly hour," said Smith, who was nothing to the eye except a very big man trying to make himself small, "because I am coming to the conclusion that existence is really too rotten. I know all the arguments of the thinkers that think otherwise, bishops and agnostics, and those sort of people, and knowing you were the greatest living authority on the pessimist thinkers." "All thinkers," said Eames, "are pessimist thinkers." After a patch of pause, not the first, for this depressing conversation had gone on for some hours with alternations of cynicism and silence, the warden continued with his air of weary brilliancy. "It's all a question of wrong calculation. The moth flies into the candle because he does not happen to know that the game is not worth the candle. The wasp gets into the jam in hearty and hopeful efforts to get the jam into him. In the same way, the vulgar people want to enjoy life just as they want to enjoy gin, because they are too stupid to see that they are paying too big a price for it. That they never find happiness, that they don't even know how to look for it, is proved by the paralysing clumsiness and ugliness of everything they do. Their discordant colours are cries of pain. Look at the brick villas beyond the college on this side of the river. There's one with spotted blinds. Look at it. Just go and look at it. Of course," he went on dreamily, "one or two men see the sober fact a long way off. They go mad. Do you notice that maniacs mostly try either to destroy other things, or, if they are thoughtful, to destroy themselves? The madman is the man behind the scenes, like the man that wanders about the coulisses of the theatre. He has only opened the wrong door and come to the right place. He sees things at the right angle. But the common world—" "Oh, hang the common world," said the sullen Smith, letting his fist fall on the table in an idle despair. "Let's give it a bad name first," said the Professor calmly, "and then hang it. A puppy with hydrophobia would probably struggle for life while we killed it. But if we were kind, we should kill it. So an omniscient God would put us out of our pain. He would strike us dead." "Why doesn't he strike us dead?" asked the undergraduate abstractly, plunging his hands into his pockets. "He is dead himself," said the philosopher. "That is where he is really enviable." To anyone who thinks," proceeded Eames, "the pleasures of life, trivial and soon tasteless, are bribes to bring us into a torture chamber. We all see that for any thinking man mere extinction is the— What are you doing? Are you mad? Put that thing down." Dr. Eames had turned his tired but still talkative head over his shoulder, and had found himself looking into a small round black hole, rimmed by a six-sided circlet of steel, with a sort of spike standing on the top. It fixed him like an iron eye. Through those eternal instants during which the reason is stunned, he did not even know what it was. Then he saw behind it the chambered barrel and cocked hammer of a revolver, and behind that the flushed and rather heavy face of Smith, apparently quite unchanged, or even more mild than before. "I'll help you out of your hole, old man," said Smith, with rough tenderness. "I'll put the puppy out of his pain." Emerson Eames retreated towards the window. "Do you mean to kill me?" he cried. "It's not a thing I do for every one," said Smith with emotion, "but you and I seem to have got so intimate to-night somehow. I know all your troubles now, and the only cure, old chap." "Put that thing down!" shouted the Warden. "It'll soon be over, you know," said Smith, with the air of a sympathetic dentist. And as the Warden made a run for the window and balcony, his benefactor followed him with a firm step and a compassionate expression. Both men were perhaps surprised to see that the grey and white of early daybreak had come already. One of them, however, had emotions calculated to swallow up surprise. Brakespeare College was one of the few that retained real traces of Gothic ornament, and just beneath Dr. Eames's balcony there ran out what had perhaps been a flying buttress, still shapelessly shaped into a grey beasts and devils, but blinded with mosses and washed out with rains. With an ungainly and most courageous leap, Eames sprang out onto this antique bridge as the only possible mode of escape from the maniac. He sat astride of it, still in his academic gown, dangling his long thin legs, and considering further chances of flight. The whitening daylight opened under as well as over him that impression of vertical infinity already remarked about the little lakes round Brakespeare. Looking down and seeing the spires and chimneys pendant in the pools, they felt alone in space. They felt as if they were looking over the edge from the North Pole and seeing only the South Pole below. End of section 15.